I really don't have a way to explain away what I experienced. I'll do my best to tell you what happened to me. This was in 2012. I woke up early on a Saturday morning. I had this sense of excitement and anticipation. I was preparing for my first overnight camping trip. Now, since then, I've done many ventures out in the outdoors, and I love it. Even though this was absolutely terrifying, I have refused to let this experience soil my love for the outdoors. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm orange glow across the sky. I grabbed my backpack, packed with all the essentials for my first night outdoors. As I made my way, I still remember the cool morning mountain air brushing against my skin. It was so chilly that it sent shivers down my spine. But I couldn't help but smile as I breathed in the fresh scent of forest and fresh air. There was this earthy aroma of pine needles and a sweet fragrance. After hiking for about 4 hours, I felt like I reached a good enough spot. There was this clearing, nestled in what I'd call a small valley, surrounded by tall, towering trees that reached very high into the sky. It almost cast a perfect little shadow. I could hear the sound of a nearby stream. It was extremely soothing, the only background noise to an otherwise quiet but happy forest. I quickly set up my tent and my essentials, taking care to make sure that it was sturdy and secure. As I worked, I could hear all the birds and squirrels rustling in the leaves, chirping. The ground beneath me was soft and spongy, covered in a thick layer of pine needles and leaves from the previous fall. Once my tent was officially set up, I started a fire. It took a few tries, but eventually I managed to get a small flame going. As the fire continued to grow, it cracked and popped, sending sparks dancing into the air. I sat back, watching as the fire warmed my face and cast a soft, flickering light. The day wore on, and I decided to make the best of it. I explored the surrounding area, looking for any supplies I could possibly muster. I would hike around the forest, marveling at all the towering trees and intricate web of streams and rivers that flowed within this tiny valley. I also came across a small meadow where I paused to take in the beauty of all the flowers that had dotted the landscape. It was late March, early April, and spring was making its way. The nature around me was absolutely breathtaking. I felt like I was in another world. You see, with my background, I hadn't spent much time in the outdoors. I mean, it's something I'd always wanted to do, but this was a first. Getting to be out on my own, by myself, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. It was like something else you could only imagine. Something I could only have dreamt of. Just a little ways outside the meadow was this small, dense patch of forest. It was pretty dark because the canopy was thick, or at least what emerging canopy there was, because all the leaves had not grown in yet. But the branches were so thick and low, it almost created this cool little Narnia-esque forest that you wanted to explore. Now, I was at most a mile, maybe a mile and a half away from my campsite. This is important for later. As I made my way across the meadow towards this dense patch of woods, I noticed a stink that reminded me of death. Well, looking down, I saw the source of it. It was a fairly large deer. No, it was a buck. Animals die out here all the time, but the issue I had with this kill was the manner in which I found it. It was completely skinned from head to toe. not like the way that a hunter would dress a deer. This was different. It looked as if something had ripped its skin off its body. Not to mention, when a hunter dresses a deer, they also take out all the guts and would leave them in a pile. The deer had not even been cut into, and by the looks of it, it had been dead for, I'd say, no less than 3 days. It stunk. There were flies, lots of them. Along this buck's neck were several large, what I would describe as puncture-like wounds. They were large, but not like that of a bullet. They looked different, as if they were punctured with a tool of some kind, and this yellow, bloody-like pus oozed from them, or at least did several days ago, and the remaining fluid had dried and coagulated. I was a little disgusted and disturbed by what I saw, but I decided to venture on further into the woods. The first thing I noticed as I made my way into this very thick patch of forest was not just how low the branches were, but how dark it was. It was almost eerie. As I ventured in a little further to see if I can find any supplies like sticks or branches that I could use for, building a fire, I also realized that everything around me was growing quiet. I'm not sure if you've ever heard the term deafening silence, but that's what it kind of became. I don't think I was more than maybe 100 or 200 yards into this patch of woods, which I know some would say is a considerable amount, but I swear to you, I began to hear almost a whisper-like voice, if that makes sense. Whatever it was calling me, or so that's how I felt or heard it. But the noise didn't make sense, because it was coming from deeper into the forest, deeper where it got thicker, denser, and the bramble and brush grew thicker and lower. Remember that this was just at the very beginning of spring, so a lot of the plants, trees, and branches were very bare. But even that was so thick and entwined, it still was enough to cover it and make it dark, or at least darker than what I was currently in. It kind of gave me the creeps, especially with this whisper voice calling me. The best way I can describe the voice to you, it wasn't as if somebody was actually out there calling my name, but it was almost like somebody whispering at a loud volume, if that makes sense. Like it was coming from everywhere, but at the same time, it had a direction. And there was something more to it. It was almost monotone and robotic in a way. I'm not really good at explaining it, but if I had to, that's probably the best explanation I can give. When I say there was something more to it, it's just there was an energy about it, as if my body was responding to it and as if I was drawn in to whatever this voice was or wherever it was coming from. It gave me really, really bad vibes. I had my knife in my hand because, I'm out here in the woods. I have no idea who or what I could run into. And I know there are native tribes around here, or at least reservations, but I wasn't really educated on who, where, or how many. And I'm mentioning these things because the voice, or loud whisper voice, whatever you want to call it, kind of had this native shamanistic chant to it, or at least that's what I discerned. I decided it was probably best to head back to camp, and I kind of figured that, maybe I'm exhausted, maybe I'm just dehydrated. So I made my way out, walked all the way across the meadow, down one of the paths, through the woods, and back to my camp. When I got back, I had to restart the fire, and the sun was also getting ready to set. It was in the evening time, and I was surprised that I had spent the majority of the afternoon enjoying myself around the woods, just exploring and finding supplies. Anything I could use, really. not just wood and things for a fire. But there was something else now, and I'm not trying to be over-exaggerative here, but I could have sworn that the energy around me had shifted. It didn't feel as peaceful as it did before. There was this sense of uneasiness that had washed over me, like a dread just lingering in the pit of your gut. It wasn't too heavy at this point, but you could feel it just lingering in the air. Now, part of me just chalked it up to the night and being nervous that it was my first night out there by myself. So, looking back, that's what I think I wrote it off as. I stayed up around the fire as it grew darker, and the feelings of unease and dread never changed. Surprisingly, the night around me was relatively quiet. Yeah, there were crickets, but they seemed a lot quieter than usual. And there were several points as I sat near the fire that I could have sworn that it got completely dead silent. I remember I was listening to every sound around me, worried that a mountain lion or a bear might stumble across my campsite and decide to have a second dinner. Fortunately, that never happened. But I'm pretty sure I heard movement in the woods coming in my direction. I mean, it's the forest. Of course there would be deer and other animals. But it sounded different. It felt different. After a few more hours of this going on, I decided that it was time for bed, and I just was probably exhausted from the day. So I climbed inside my tent as the last bit of my fire were nothing but red embers. Fortunately, and surprisingly, in that situation looking back, I was able to lull myself into a sleep. A deep sleep. Now, I can remember this first night, I had these strange, vivid dreams. The first one, I was a shaman watching this tribe dance in front of me with a large roaring fire. I remember I shot lightning out of my hands into the fire, and a face appeared. This face was hideous, ugly, and scarred, but began speaking to me in a language that I did not understand, but I could feel as if it resonated within my very soul. I felt like it was telling me terrible secrets that someone would know if they wielded dark magic, secrets of murder, secrets of shapeshifting and sacrifice. That was the first dream. The second, I was a wolf on all fours hunting in the woods, and I came upon a man and his tent in the middle of nowhere. You can imagine where this dream was going. It was fierce. I pounced on him in his tent, and I tore him to shreds. I'm savoring all the terrible, gory details, because the dream was extremely vivid, and it was almost as if my spirit had left my body, and I was experiencing another reality. That's how alive and vivid these dreams were. I woke up in the early morning, with the sun just cresting over the horizon, and I was in a cold sweat. The dreams were too much that I had had the night before. Now, once I climbed out of my tent to make a fire to prep breakfast, I noticed something very strange. Footprints all around my campsite. Not just any footprints, but large, hooved, clawed footprints, or so I would describe them. I studied them a bit further, and they disturbed me. I could not quite understand what animal this was that had gone rummaging through my campsite. The tracks, there was something wrong. They were not quadrupedal, like a deer, bear, or any other sort of animal you'd find in the woods. These were two, a set of two, and they moved like that, giving way that whoever or whatever this was was either wearing boots or it was walking on two legs. I tried not to entertain the thought more and just assumed somebody had boots that they wore that were shaped like this and were walking around, maybe looking for stuff. Perhaps a lone vagabond looking for supplies to steal. I mean, after all, there's only a town maybe 6 miles away. It is possible. But one thing that really bothered me wasn't so much the shape of the track. It was the gait. It almost seemed impossible for a human to replicate. The more and more anxiety I would get over it by looking at them and studying them and trying to hypothesize who or what it could be, I just had to let it go and stop looking at them because I felt like I was working myself up and it was ultimately going to ruin my experience out here. So, after breakfast, I decided to get my supplies together and go explore another part of the woods that I had not had a chance to do the day prior. So, this time, I went to the southwest direction, over a larger hill, and into another valley. As I'm making my way into this smaller valley, I noticed that same weird energy feeling. The same feeling I felt when I was in that dense patch of forest. It's almost as if the air becomes thicker, more electrical and alive. But it's also a feeling of dread and uncertainty. Like your gut just reacts and knows that you're in either predator territory or that something bad is going to happen. I can remember at the moment I assumed that there was either a mama bear with her cubs around or I was very close to a mountain lion den. Thinking it was the latter, I decided to book it back to where my camp was because I really wasn't wanting to get attacked. As I made my way back up over the tall hill, I heard it again. It was that same monotone, almost AM radio-esque voice calling me. Except the voice wasn't coming from the area of the forest where the thick patch of woods were the previous day. This was back in the direction of the small valley I had just come from. And also something new. I had smelt the aroma, the unmistakable aroma of death. I was looking around confused, and I noticed something I had not. Now keep in mind that when I went over this large hill into this small valley, I went one way. On my way out, I went around a large grouping of trees, so it wasn't exactly the same way. And here is where I smelt that same unmistakable odor of death. Around me, in the trees, probably about 40 feet up, were 2 deer, and just like the first one, they were completely skinned and hung over this large branch. There was no blood dripping. They weren't cut open. They weren't gutted. It was as if something had de-skinned them and hung them up there. You can tell I was probably a little disturbed by my finding. There is no evidence of anybody ever being out here. No tools, no rope to lower them up and down. Nothing. I kept trying to think from the perspective of someone who's out here hunting for meat, why they would do this. Because the kills looked relatively fresh. No older than a couple of days at most. And I had that same creeping sensation that something was very wrong. In conjunction with me hearing the voice and seeing these 2 kills, I decided I should probably just go hang out at my camp for the rest of the day and just sit tight. It took me roughly about an hour to make it back to my tent. There was something different now. It's almost as if the peace and tranquility of the morning mountain air had been stolen. It was now replaced with this almost buzzing electrical sensation around me, almost like a low mechanic hum. And in the pit of my stomach, I felt nothing but dread. I tried to rationalize everything and just explain to myself, you're very dehydrated, you're not sleeping like you're supposed to, you're just overly paranoid. Try eating some lunch, that'll help. Which I did, and it did not help. In fact, I could barely eat. What's even stranger is as I sat at my campsite, pondering what to do and what the source of these strange happenings were, the smell of death began to come and fill my entire campsite. I was looking around, but I couldn't see any trace or any source of where the smell is coming from. Now keep in mind that my campsite and everything was in a smaller clearing, wide enough that I could see pretty much everything around me, and the trees right near where I had my tent were open enough that if anyone was coming, or anything, for example, like a mountain lion or a bear, I would have a clear view, especially on a day like this where the sun was shining. So I couldn't exactly make out where this odor was coming from. There was also hardly any wind. And as the afternoon began to give way to the later afternoon and early evening, the odor continued to intensify. And as you can imagine, I had never regretted more in my life not having a firearm on my side. Stupid. Incredibly dumb. I had a pretty good knife, or at least what I considered to be a good sharp knife, but I realized that was not going to keep me safe if there really was a large predator around, like a bear or a mountain lion. Then the sun began to set, and the odor never went anywhere. I can remember much of that evening covering my face because it smelt as if there were 10 dead deer within 25 feet of my campsite. It was so bad. For those of you who ranch, or are out and have smelt a dead cow or a dead horse, you'll know how strong and how stinky the smell of death can be. That's what it was like. It was overpowering. I feel that if you haven't had that, and you've only ever just smelt roadkill, then you probably won't quite understand the power of the odor of death that was there. So, I sat around my campfire and just tried to do my best that I could to keep my mind off things and stay positive and ignore the ominous signs all around me that something was very wrong. The night began to grow exceptionally cold in a short amount of time. It was almost like an ominous breeze blowing through, chilling me to the bone. I don't remember exactly what time I first noticed this, but it was later. It's like my body was anchored down to the spot near my fire, trying my darndest to keep warm, and the fire seemed to just dwindle down more and more, no matter how much wood I put on it. At one point, I heard something moving in my direction. I prayed and prayed that it wasn't a mountain lion or bear, but the closer it came, I noticed two things. The first is that it was very heavy. With every step that it took, I can hear things crunching underneath, and just the impact on the ground. The second is that it wasn't quadrupedal. These steps were bipedal. I assumed it was the same person who had been out here doing all this damage. The deer, the leaving the tracks around my campsite. I gripped my knife, thinking that it's showtime. I'm about to get attacked, possibly mugged, if not murdered. That there's somebody living out here, causing this. As it got closer, it stopped, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I looked up, and I called out, "I know you're here. I know what you've been doing. Show yourself." It stayed quiet, and I noticed now that not only had the sounds of the forest completely ceased, which they had already been, but it almost seemed as if things were quieter than they ever were, or ever could have been. Now, maybe this was just my imagination, but I could have sworn I saw two eyes glaring at me. It was like this ominous yellow glow, but they looked animalistic, if that makes any sense, from the distance in which I was looking. They were pretty high up too, and I would just see it move along the tree line in the eastern direction, going away from me, but almost as if it was trying to keep an eye on me. And I say it because I don't think it was a person. It sounds silly for me to say this, but part of me wonders if this was some sort of shamanistic native spirit of some kind. I don't know, I'm just guessing. The feelings and vibes I got from this thing felt sinister and evil in every way, as if it had only bad intentions. Within, I would say, no more than 5 to 10 minutes of it being in sight of me, or at least that I knew it was there, that same voice started up again. What I like to call the AM radio voice. Monotone, distorted, strange, and almost undiscernible. But yet, I could feel it was calling to me. It was shortly after that I started to get this intense dizzy spell that overtook my entire being. Now, I don't want to tell this story and make it seem like I was just this calm, collective person, because I was freaking out. I was screaming at this person or thing to leave, and it would not. And as the dizziness overtook me, I blacked out. Or at least, that's the last I remember. Now, at this point in the story, things definitely get weirder. After I had lost consciousness and fully blacked out, the very next thing that I could remember was waking up in the meadow that was roughly a mile or so away from my campsite. It was probably late morning or noon, what I would assume was the following day, unless I had blacked out longer, I don't know, but my shirt was missing, and I had blood all over my hands. Blood that wasn't mine. I felt extremely drained of energy, as if I had just ran 20 miles in 24 hours. I have never felt that exhausted. Yet, I had this strange, ringing, buzzing sensation all over my body. I felt incredibly sick and incredibly nauseous and delirious. Like, for a while there, I didn't know where I was, I didn't know who I was, or why I had dried blood all over my hands, arms, chest, and face. I decided to make my way back to camp, only to find my tent and supplies shredded and scattered everywhere. I got it. I got the gist. Whatever or whoever was here made it very clear that I was not welcome. I wasn't thinking that in the moment, but looking back, there's no other conclusion to draw upon. I was just trying to collect myself and grab what little things I had left that were not destroyed, along trying to find my clothing, which I never found, and I had to hike the track all the way back to my vehicle. I was originally going to try to stay a few more nights before all this craziness happened, but that's not how it worked out. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had these strange burn marks all over my chest and back. It reminded me as if someone had taken something hot, like maybe a knife blade, and had burned my skin with it. But what was strange was if you were to actually look at my chest and stomach and back, there were no marks, there were no cut or burn marks, there was no indication that I had actually been physically hurt or assaulted in any way. Yet, my skin would flare up and it would burn excruciatingly bad. I would also get these horrible dizzy spells from time to time and these incredibly awful bouts of nausea. These were, I would say, probably the following couple of weeks after this whole adventure. Now, once I made it back home and I was able to get cleaned up, I ended up getting fired from my job because I couldn't go to work. I was so deathly sick that I was pretty much bedridden for 2 to 3 weeks after this, along with the strange burning sensations and pain underneath my skin. As you can imagine, this experience was extremely traumatizing at the time. And fortunately, I made a recovery, but it wouldn't be till the fall of that same year where I got a chance to speak to some friends of mine that are native, and I actually got to tell them my entire story, a much more condensed version than what I wrote out. They told me that it either is two things: a skinwalker or some sort of dark guardian spirit, that I must have stumbled upon territory that I was never allowed or should not have been allowed to go into, and that from the description that I gave him, he said that it sounds like this spirit had taken over and possessed my body, and God only knows what else. This whole experience and story really kept me out of the forest for a few years, and it wasn't until roughly 2015 or 2016 that I regained enough of my footing emotionally to step back into the forest and try this all again. I can say that, fortunately for me, I've never at all had an experience like I did. In fact, you could probably imagine how apprehensive I am about talking about this story, because, well, who's going to believe me? And you know what? I'm at the point to where I really don't care. This is my story, and I'll tell the people who I feel comfortable telling it to. If they don't believe it, that's fine. But many of my native friends, or at least a few of them, have stories that are far more horrendous than mine. Far more nightmarish than you can ever imagine. I'm not sure what entity or person or thing was guarding the woods that day, but whatever it was did not want me out there. In 1999, I was living in a small house with my parents, sister, and brother. My family had just moved to this new place from another state, so we didn't have much furniture or anything else for that matter. I slept on the couch because there weren't enough beds for everyone. Yet, our dog slept next to me at night, as she always did when we all went to bed. One particular night, after being asleep for hours already, I woke up around 3 a.m. and saw what appeared to be an older man standing by the door, staring directly at me. My eyes were still adjusting though, but he wore black clothing, which stood out against the white walls of my parents' room where his body was mostly positioned towards. His face was gaunt looking, but not scary, if that makes sense. He seemed very pale, but wasn't exactly creepy looking, although he did appear quite thin and skeletal-like in appearance. I froze in fear while staring back at him through squinting eyes. It hurt trying to look more clearly due to how bright everything seemed, even though there was only one light bulb that hung above us near the ceiling inside our home. He suddenly vanished without making any sounds whatsoever. After realizing this happened, I told myself never again will I let myself fall asleep unless someone stays awake watching over me. Now a few nights go by, and something far worse occurs. I wake up again around 3 a.m. This time, my dog was no longer lying next to me on the couch where I slept. She usually never left my side at night, so something must have happened with her that caused her to leave. This freaked me out badly since she loved sleeping right by my arm and hand area every single night. After realizing this, I looked over towards the door and saw what appeared to be a very tall being turning around. It stopped, turned turned back to face me, and all I could see was a skeletal face and bright orange eyes with no pupils. The worst part was that he had large fangs protruding out of his mouth. I immediately sat up on the couch and screamed, while also yelling for my parents, who slept in their bedroom right across from where this thing stood. I can remember very vividly. His face was very angular looking, cheekbones very high and standing out. He also had long dark hair covering most of the top half of his head, while he wore a black trench coat-like robe which went down past his feet. I don't really remember what happened after that, but I do recall waking up the next day, and everything felt normal. Now, a few months later, we moved out of that house due to many strange things happening there, including hearing voices coming from what sounded like inside our walls and ceiling, seeing shadowy figures move around in front of us when going into different rooms. We never did figure out who or what it was exactly, but we had speculation. My parents knew of somebody, well, an enemy, who lived nearby. They had apparently been doing all sorts of voodoo and black magic for some reason. I was never told the full story because both my parents have passed, but apparently my parents and this man must have rubbed each other the wrong way, and little did they know he practiced hexes and curses, because it sounds like that's what he was doing. I'm not saying this as a matter of fact. It's just a theory, but my parents suspected that he had been the one who was conjuring demons and spirits to come and attack us. That's why we moved out. It was by far the scariest experience of my life. I'll always remember my father's theory on all of this. He thinks that this old man was not just a magic practitioner, but a shapeshifter of some kind. He can recall sitting out on the front porch with his tobacco pipe and seeing this unusually large coyote come by almost every night with what he described as disturbingly human-like eyes. Now, make that what you will, but when you put two and two together, you kind of can't help but come up with the same conclusion that me and my family did. My name is Heather, and it's no secret that strange stuff goes on the reservation. For a while, my family and I lived on the Apache reservation. We were there for almost 2 years, but closer to 1.5 years. At the time, I was pregnant with my youngest daughter. This was probably about 2 a.m. I had been up with my other daughter, who was very, very sick. My husband and son were asleep in the living room. They were watching TV, or at least were before they too had fallen asleep. Now, right about 5:15 a.m, it was still dark out, and we heard a loud knock on our door. It was so violent and loud, it made me jump out of bed, thinking that it must be someone trying to break in. I quickly got dressed and went to the door, but when I opened it, there was no one in sight. My husband and son were still snoring on the couch with the TV blaring. But the commotion of me going out there and opening the door had awoken both of them. They both gave me puzzled expressions, like they weren't sure what was going on. We all kind of stood around, looking out there in the dark to try and see where this knock had come from, because my husband and son did not hear the knock. We're all three out there, looking around in the dark as to who could have knocked, when this huge rock flies by our heads and shatters the window. We all scream, scared to death. We all run back inside. Then, within moments, Another large rock comes flying, hitting the other window, shattering it. At this point, my sick daughter is screaming. She's scared. My son is terrified. And my husband has his rifle ready to blow away whoever is doing this. He goes back outside, and he's gone for at least 20 minutes. He comes back, shaking his head as if he doesn't know where the rock thrower could have been hiding. A little layout of the land real quick. Outside of our house, there really wasn't a whole lot of area where you could hide. So when he ventured out there, he did not have to scout very far to find possible evidence of someone being out there. But he did not. And he scoured around even further, even into the woodline by our house, and found nothing. He didn't find anybody. My husband and I started talking about what we thought it could be or who could have thrown it. We're kind of in a pretty rural section of the reservation at the time. There's really not that many people around here, and not that many walking around at 3, 4, or 5 in the morning. My husband is full-blooded Apache, so, like his people, and I mean no disrespect, but they are very superstitious of supernatural things, and he was scared. He was convinced it was a witch. We got to talking more, and he asked me if I had heard a loud bang earlier in the night. He said it was probably around midnight, but I told him I was asleep with our daughter, and didn't wake up till around 2 to give her some coughing medicine. We stayed up, hopped up on adrenaline, and we were all pretty freaked out and scared. As soon as the sun came out and provided just enough light for us to see, my husband went back out. He was shocked by what he had found. Behind our house is exactly where the sound of that loud bang he had heard only hours before at around midnight. For you see, we had an old, sort of dilapidated shed. We hadn't used it. It was just there when we had moved in. Apparently, there was roughly this 50-pound rock wedged in the wall that somebody had thrown with such force that it had actually lodged itself into the metal of the wall. That was enough for us. We got a motel and stayed there for a few nights to try and forget about all of this. When we came back, it never felt the same. I did not even like my kids playing outside. It felt like it wasn't safe for them, like they would get hurt. We had a small creek down by that trailer. I would say no more than 70 to 80 feet away from the house. There would be some times at night I would hear things I couldn't explain. Talking, conversation, noises, things that had no right to be there. There were multiple times my kids would come home from playing in the creek crying and screaming because the wolfman had tried to get them. This only happened probably about 5 or 6 times over the course of a year and a half. So not too much, but enough that it terrified my kids. Within a few months' time of living there, I'd say after the first summer, they were too scared to go down and play by the creek. That's where they said it lived. I wouldn't call myself superstitious or a believer in the supernatural at all, but I realized the fear and absolute terror my kids and family experienced was real and genuine. I just don't know what to or how to explain it. The following fall came, and we were fortunate enough to move to Southern California. We have not had any issues since. The house we're in now does not feel creepy, and it's nice to know that my kids feel safe. There was something off about that piece of property, though. I will say that. I wouldn't go as far as saying that it gave me the creeps, but there was something off about it, and I know my husband sensed it too. He went on and on about it, quite a few times, actually. And going back to the witch comment he had made, he claimed that there was a witch after his family, and that all these things our kids supposedly seeing a wolfman and our house getting attacked, and all the other things that happened were apparently because this witch had it out for him. I've never pressed the issue any further, but I'm just telling you my experiences. It feels good to be safe, knowing that someone or something was trying to hurt us. My wife and I moved up here from Arizona in the summer of 2018. We bought a house on 2 acres, and we're still continually fixing it up ever since. I've been fortunate enough that I can work from home and run my business outside my home, so it enables me to be outside on my property every day, usually with my dog or just by myself. We've had some weird things happen, but nothing too crazy until yesterday. I was out there by myself. My dog had been acting weird all day and refused to go outside with me, so I decided to just let him stay inside. It was around 1 p.m., and I heard this loud bang from the back side of my property. I assumed it was a gunshot at first, but then I realized nobody would be shooting here in the middle of the day. And besides, there's no hunting season going on right now. So I kind of just shrugged it off and kept working for another hour before deciding to go and check out what made that noise. I walked around my property line towards where I heard the sound, and all of a sudden, something comes running from behind some trees about 30 yards away. It looked like an extremely muscular man wearing nothing but brown pants with long dark hair. It, or he, ran across the property line and into a thick patch of trees. You can imagine my complete and utter shock as I stood there for a second before running back to my house. I assumed there was some wild Neanderthal on the loose. I locked all the doors and windows, grabbed my .44, then went outside onto my deck overlooking where this thing had been. I sat there for about an hour or so, but did not see anything else moving around out there, just besides the usual birds and squirrels. So, the afternoon wasn't too weird until that happened. Today is another story, though. Today, while working on one of our rooms upstairs with music playing loudly through headphones, I hear this thud on my wall. Immediately, I took off my headphones, listening for any other noises, but I didn't hear anything else besides my own dog going crazy downstairs. I went down to find him hiding under one of the tables in our dining room, his tail tucked between his legs. This is not like him. So, being as dumb as I could possibly be, without taking a single weapon or anything, I decided to go out and check on what was going on. I step outside, and along the house, there are these horrendously large claw marks. They're running all along the side of the house, right where I'd heard the thud. So I go and take a picture and send it to my wife to see what she thinks. She's disturbed by it, but isn't sure what it could be. The claw marks are about 7 or 8 feet up off the ground. Very strange. I tell her I'll go and investigate. Maybe something was trying to get into our house. I looked around but did not find much. I did notice fresh dirt in one spot along the property line. This is where there are many trees and bushes growing up against one of our fences. It appeared as if someone had dug a rather large hole, probably maybe 3 to 4 feet wide, and it went down into a tunnel under the fence. It wasn't like what you'd expect where a dog or an animal would just dig underneath a fence line to get through. Whoever had dug this really took their time. But who did this, is what I was thinking. Who would come out to our property and dig a small tunnel? The tunnel shot down, and it was too dark for me to see where it led to. I spent the afternoon going out there with a shovel and filling it up as much as I could. The tunnel was surprisingly deep. As of now, it's in the evening time, and we have not had anything else weird happen yet. I'll be sure to write to you more if something does pop up. As for now, stay safe, and remember, always keep a firearm on you. I lived in Southern Oregon for a time. I was visiting my girlfriend, who lived in a trailer park. I had been staying up there with her for about 2 weeks, and had not seen anything out of the ordinary. One night, I woke up to use the bathroom. As soon as I stood up from my bed, I saw a pair of yellow eyes staring at me through the window. It was about 10 feet away, and it appeared to have its head cocked to one side, as if listening intently for something. I froze in place, not even breathing for fear that it would notice me. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds, it turned around and vanished from sight. I bolted to the bathroom, locked the door. Then, I decided to turn on every light I could. It was about 1 a.m, so my girlfriend and her mother, who lived with her, were asleep. I stayed up all night, with a knife from the kitchen drawer beside me, against whatever this was for protection. At around 4 a.m, there were scratching noises coming from outside the same window. I didn't dare look. At 5 a.m, the sun rose, and whatever it was had stopped making these awful groaning noises. I left as soon as my girlfriend woke up at around 6 to get ready for work. I never stayed there again after that night, and I'm not sure what it was. Well, about a week later, one of my friends asked me about the Native American jewelry that I often wore, and mentioned how cool it was. When I told him what had happened to me a few nights earlier, he freaked out at me and told me I needed to get rid of that stuff, that it would summon bad spirits. He wouldn't tell me what they were, but he said that I had been under the Skinwalker's spell since wearing it, and I had to get rid of all signs that it was there. He would explain that these witches could shapeshift into the form of an animal and track down who wore these specific kinds of jewelry, which is what must have happened because nobody else that I know knew what I was talking about. He took these things from me and gave me sage and sweetgrass, used for protection against evil spirits. After hearing about skinwalkers from my friend, many other things became apparent that perhaps I had overlooked. My girlfriend would tell me that she had woken up a few other nights to scratching noises out her window, but she never saw anything. Her mom claims to have seen a tall, dark shadow lurking outside the trailer one evening on her way home. However, my girlfriend would sometimes wake up around 2 a.m. and see this same shadow moving outside her window. Many days after I left my girlfriend's house at night for good, I'd be driving down Interstate 5 into the early morning hours, probably about 20 miles south of Eugene. There have been times where I swear I see this large black dog on 2 legs running along the road. It seems like it's trotting, as if keeping pace with traffic. I've never seen this entity myself, in full, but I'm nervous to find out what it might be. I feel that the Skinwalker incident and proximity to the large black dog that I can't physically see, that there must be something going on. It was the summer of 1985 when my family and I packed up everything we owned and headed out towards our new home on a piece of rural land roughly 12 miles outside of a native reservation. My parents had always dreamed of living in the countryside, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. They finally found the perfect spot. My dad was always a deal watcher. He would always snag things for dirt cheap, and this piece of property was no exception. He never understood why we were able to get it for such a good deal. It must have just been the area. We drove down our dusty road towards our new home, passing fields of corn and wheat, and the occasional herd of cattle grazing lazily. The air seemed fresh and clean, and everything seemed so new and exciting. It's like the anticipation would build with each passing mile. We finally arrived at our new property, and we were greeted by an older but relatively updated cabin, nestled in the midst of the tall trees. It was rustic and charming, with a large porch that wrapped around the front and sides. My younger brother and I immediately ran up the stairs and into the cabin, exploring every nook and cranny we could. The interior was really nice, cozy, and inviting. Right away, you could tell that whoever had built, owned, and maintained this place did an exceptionally well job. Within a couple of days' time, my parents had already unpacked most of our belongings, and we spent the remaining days settling in and getting to know our new surroundings. Over the next few days, we explored the area around, discovering hidden streams and small ponds, even stumbling upon an old, abandoned, and partially dilapidated barn. My parents spent a lot of their time outside, tending to a garden that they had begun planting. As we made our first trip into town to stock up on supplies, we drove through a few areas of the reservation, and weirdly enough, we were warmly greeted but also warned about the area we lived in. As we made our way back to the cabin, we couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and wonder at this new world we were going to get to live in. The land around us was full of hidden adventures and treasures, surprises as well. It had been probably 2 or so months since our family had moved into our new home on the rural land just outside of the reservation. My younger brother and I would be spending most of our time exploring the woods and fields surrounding it. But on one particular day, my brother stumbled upon something that would change our perceptions of the land forever. He had been wandering around the back side of the property, and he noticed a large mound of dirt and rocks piled up in a circular formation. It was unlike anything we had seen before, and it caught our attention. As we approached the mound, we could feel something different about it. I didn't know this at the time, but this was a burial mound. My brother and I were both intrigued, but after telling our father about it, he strictly warned us to stay away from it. Our father had always been a cautious man, at least on certain things. He had a very deep respect for history and culture of the people who had lived there long before we had arrived. He warned us that the mound was an Indian burial site, and it was very important to show respect for the dead. Despite our father's warning, my brother and I couldn't resist the temptation to explore the mound and around it. We spent many days circling around it, marveling at its size, and the strange, mysterious energy that was around it. But at the same time, every time we explored around it, there was just this unspoken sense of unease. After several weeks of playing around this mound, strange things began to happen all over. It started in the home. Small things like objects moving on their own, or even strange noises in the night, like conversations or talking, or weird dinging sounds, thuds, crashes. And soon the activity would escalate to something far more malevolent. My brother and I began to see shadows moving in our home and in the woods at nighttime. We could hear strange whispers coming from the hallway. When we would wake up in the morning, we'd go outside to play and find these strange, almost ancient-looking symbols etched into the dirt right around the mound. As the months went by, the activity grew more and more intense. We would hear strange growls and snarls at night, and there were nights where we could feel something was watching us. The sense of unease continued to grow and had been more and more present as time went on. Looking back, I believe it came from the mound. We tried to ignore these strange occurrences. My father was a hard atheist and would never entertain such a ridiculous notion as the paranormal. But at points, even he too could not rationally explain away what was going on. It was impossible to deny what was happening. Our family began to feel the effects of the activity. My parents would sometimes wake up with these unexplainable bruises and scratches. We would all suffer from night terrors and horrendous nightmares. My parents began fighting violently. It was clear, looking back, that something demonic was at work. It was only a matter of time before things would escalate even worse. And of course, I'm only giving you the Reader's Digest version, because there were a lot more things that went on, things that went bad. Oh, I wanted to mention, when we moved in, we also had 3 cats and a dog. After playing around the mound, within 8 months' time, all 4 of our pets had died under mysterious circumstances. One of our cats we never saw again. The other cat was found dead near the fence line on the far side of our cabin. She looked like she had just collapsed and died. My father told us it was a heart attack. The other one, well, this one isn't for the faint of heart, for anyone reading this who loves animals. But I'll tell you anyway. I did not find her. My dad did, or what was left of her. All he found was a head, the lone head of a cat, sitting right on top of a tree stump. I don't know who did it, or what, or why, but he said that the head was cut cleanly off. Now, these also were not kittens. We had these cats for at least 10 years. They were all from the same litter, going back from the 70s. My dad never did find the body to the cat, but is convinced that somebody was up there messing with us. Now our dog, she too disappeared without a trace. Within that same year's time, as I already described, my parents' fighting became extremely violent. It went from verbal to physical, to throwing things, breaking parts of the cabin, even physically attacking each other. What was at one point a beautiful, brimming garden soon died and everything wilted, unexplainably. Which is weird looking back because both my parents were obsessed with their garden. They spent a lot of time tending it. And it was like it was just suddenly killed by something. This went on, by the way, for 2.5, almost 3 years. We endured a lot of trauma at that property. My father eventually sold the property to a group of developers who were planning to build a new housing development on that same plot of land. We drove away from there for the last time, and I remember feeling a sense of sadness and relief. Our time at this property had been both wonder and terror, but the memories and the trauma still do stay with us forever. It appeared as if whatever trauma my parents had experienced and endured on their end on that property stayed, because when my brother were teenagers, they not only continued fighting, but also divorced. Now, I can't say everything is centered around that burial mound, but it certainly seems that way when you look at the timeline of events and how everything strange began to happen as soon as we wouldn't leave it alone. Just my 2 cents.